I first became involved with studying the history of stone carving when I was learning stone carving and I was being taught a system by which you had to first make a model in clay, cast it in plaster, and then it could be half the size or a third the size, or it could be full size. But then you took measurements and transferred them to the carving. And I found that a little bit unpleasant because it seemed to me that you weren't developing, I wasn't developing my style based on carving, I was developing it based on clay working, and this is the way Canova is, for example. There was, and I was mildly conscious of it, there started up in the beginning of the 20th century a movement called direct carving. And sculptors such as Brancusi and Epstein were both involved with direct carving, and what it meant was not doing a model or not taking accurate measurements, but carving directly. And a teacher I had named Wallace Kelly had been a direct carver, and so I'm sure that affected me. But what happened was that I came across a book by a German named Blumel called Greek Sculptors at Work, and it was a book written originally in the 1920s or 30s and translated by Phaidon Press into English, and in which he described the archaic technique. And the archaic technique does not involve a model of any sort. It involves directly working into the stone. And so I became interested in the fact that what I was being taught was not necessarily the technique being used in the past, that the tradition that we were in was something sort of locked into what was basically a 19th century technique and not all that much used earlier. Then I made friends with an architect who was a restoration architect who was 3 years at ICCROM, which is the International Center for the Study of the Conservation of Cultural Property. And he asked me, because at that I had started looking at stone carvings and trying to figure out how they were carved. And Bernini is a wonderful example of this, and we've got the good Berninis in Rome. He asked me to come and lecture first to a group of architects on the basic tools and how stone was carved. And I developed that and was called in to teach more at ICCROM. And then at the time, there had been in the 1960s no courses in the conservation of stone particularly. And they started them up in the 1970s. That is, not conservation in general, but rather particularly the conservation and cleaning of stone. And two courses were started, one at the Istituto Centrale del Restauro and one UNESCO in Venice. And they asked me fairly right at the beginning to come and teach because I was the only person available who had both slides and an interest in tool marks and what tools had been used and how you could recognize on a carving what tools had been used for carving it. And so I started teaching that, and in the process of teaching that, I met a lot of young restorers, and they, the Istituto Centrale del Restauro at that time, restorers, when they finished the course, it was recommended that they form cooperatives. And the director of the Istituto suggested this, and that way they could, if they needed scientific help, they could make use of the scientists at the Istituto Centrale. But this also meant that people who I had taught how tools were used and how to recognize tool marks when they came into particular situations would call on me. And one of the first ones was Orvieto Cathedral, where they looked at it and were somewhat befuddled by these strange surfaces on the upper parts of the reliefs, and decided right away that it couldn't be weathering, and called in somebody from the Istituto Centrale, and she said, you should call in Peter Rockwell. And so I was then basically hired to work as a consultant on that, and out of that developed over the years being a consultant on a whole series of projects on the Roman carving, on the Trevi fountain, on the Barberini fountain. Whenever what it really came down to is whenever there was sufficient extra financing on a conservation project to do something about the history of stone carving, they thought of that. And one of the reasons for documenting the stone carving, and the Istituto developed this system of taking what was usually a correct proportional drawing and marking in different colors the different types of tool marks on it. And one of the reasons for this was so that they would establish exactly what condition the stone was in when they did the work, so that somebody coming along 30 years later would be able to recognize if something had changed. Because this is one of the problems in conservation, is that if there was a conservation done in 1950 and no records were kept of what they saw, the people coming along in 1980 don't know exactly what was original in 1950 and what has changed. So, and I could help with that because I could show them what tools were used. So that's how I became involved in the whole process, and have become somewhat involved internationally because of restorers coming from different places. And then through a student of mine who became an assistant working on the Trevi fountain, she took a course in Indian art history, and somehow or other they got into the discussion about the carving techniques, and the art historian said no one has ever written on the carving techniques in India. I think it's about time they did, and she proposed to me that we do a project together, which we have done and are now in the process of hunting for a publisher. When I'm called in to study a monument, of course I first look for any tool marks that can be seen. But then I look to see things like, was this carved in place, or was it carved before being put in place? Then I look for any signs of unfinish, and the signs of unfinish to see the way in which the carvers worked. You might say following the Cellini-esque peeling an onion, the way the carvers work their forms, if there is unfinished, the way they work slowly into the forms in a succession of carving. And that's really the basic thing that I look for, is any sign that gives you some idea of how this work was done.